Hello, I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Now imagine you've spent decades meticulously planting seeds, watering them with propaganda, fertilizing with passports, and then you casually walk in with tanks and say, "Surprise, your garden's mine now." We're going to be digging into that Kremlin's masterclass in geopolitical gardening, how Russia spent 3 decades preparing Crimea and Donbas for a surprise invasion. Think of it as the world's dreariest DIY project, featuring unwanted attachments and a paint job that says "Mother Russia" in Comic Sans. On this episode, we uncover the Kremlin's unpleasant hobby, growing instability on Ukrainian soil. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The illegal Russian annexation of Crimea and the Donbas war did not happen overnight. Both of these events have ties to the shared history between Russia and Ukraine, and were very likely something that Moscow had been planning several years ahead. It could be said that the period leading up to these events was the very first example of Russia conducting what is now called hybrid warfare, and on a scale that hasn't actually been matched since. The alleged persecution of Russian-speaking Ukrainians was a focal point of this strategy. It was a commonly recurring theme in the Kremlin's propaganda narratives leading up to 2014. Another way in which the Russians set the stage for the annexation and later war was spreading information about the so-called Russian world, Ruski Mir. Vladimir Putin himself often spoke about the shared history between Ukraine and Russia, and in a light that suggested that the two countries were inseparable. China does something similar today in regards to Taiwan.
If we really mean that it is a brotherly nation and a brotherly country, we have to act as close relatives in support of the Ukrainian people in this difficult situation.
But Russia's actions go beyond merely propaganda. Demographic and social engineering, which, for example, involved granting citizenships to Ukrainians in Crimea and promoting Russian culture, were another angle of attack for the Kremlin. Russian authorities also heavily influenced the local political scene in the Donbas and Crimea. By promoting separatist parties and pro-Russian entities, they laid the groundwork for the string of breakaway regions which appeared after 2014. All of these actions led to heavy division among Ukrainian society, which could be seen beyond just Crimea and eastern Ukraine. In the end, Russia's activities boiled down to the millennia-old and tested strategy of divide and conquer.
And now, we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Some observers and many Ukrainians say that the war with Russia started in 2014 and not in 2022. The illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia is seen as the point of no return. Here is how it took place, step by step.
In late February 2014, unmarked Russian troops supported by the Black Sea Fleet took over key infrastructure such as airports and road junctions. They also captured crucial Ukrainian security installations, which put the Ukrainian military on the back foot. The Ukrainian army was ill-prepared to deal with this threat, unlike late in 2022, and their inability to act gave the Russians the advantage they needed. Following that, Russia gradually deployed more soldiers in the thousands to Crimea and later supported them with heavy equipment and vehicles. In total, some 25,000 Russian troops were present in Crimea once this process was completed, effectively giving Moscow control over the region. Moscow also used proxy forces disguised as local militias to facilitate the process, although the Kremlin did not admit to their use. Simultaneously, the Russians deployed massive disinformation campaigns to shape international discourse surrounding the situation to Russia's benefit. In the end, the culmination point was the legal referendum, according to which Crimeans voted to join the Russian Federation.
And now, as always, it's time to explore this story in greater detail. Let's rewind to 1991, when the Soviet Union was doing its best impression of a bad breakup. Lots of chaos, tears, and one party inexplicably moving out and taking the Black Sea Fleet with them. Crimea, of course, flirted with independence fast, voting to restore its Soviet autonomy, but Ukraine swooped in, slapped a sticker that said Autonomous Republic, and sent in 60,000 National Guard troops to say, "Sorry, not today." Constitution reinforced, presidency abolished. But paper promises are as effective against espionage and propaganda as a paper umbrella is at stopping acid rain. While official documents were busy celebrating unity, Russia was sneakily handing out passports like Oprah handing out cars. You get a passport, you get a passport, everybody gets a passport. By 2014, over half of Crimeans held Russian citizenship. Meanwhile, Russian-language schools sprouted across the peninsula like mold on old cheese. Only 7 schools taught in Ukrainian, while 89.4% used Russian. Ukrainian Tatar, only preschool. 2 universities. If you wanted to speak the language of your ancestors, better pack a lunch and apply for that 1 seat. Local newspapers, 80% in Russian. 1 token Ukrainian rag funded by Kiev. It wasn't just about language, it was about identity. Planting the idea that Crimea was Russia's backyard barbecue and Ukraine was the nosy neighbor nobody invited. Fast forward to Donbas. The region had voted overwhelmingly for Ukrainian independence in 1991, about 83.9%, matching Odessa and Kharkiv. Yet by the late 90s, Russian-language schools outnumbered Ukrainian ones 3-1. And who provided most of the news? You guessed it, Russian state TV. In 2014, 71% of Donbas residents got their bulletins from Moscow. Even after the first war broke out, 14% still tuned in, like survivors of a shipwreck refusing to abandon the Titanic. Russia didn't just drop arms into separatist laps, it scripted the entire drama. They baked a narrative cake with layers of fascist junta icing, genocide of Russian speakers crumble, and garnished with existential dread. And just like that, locals went from watching Sesame Street to subscribing to Siege Street. And as the full-scale invasion of 2022 dragged Europe into a living history lesson, the world watched Russia's playbook on replay. Crimea and Donbas weren't anomalies, you see, they were rehearsals. Because when it comes to modern warfare, the battle for hearts and minds starts decades before the first shell actually lands. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Dr. Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer in Slavic and East European Studies at University College London. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good to be here.
So when thinking about Crimea and the Donbas, 2014, it's almost like a forgotten war, especially when it comes to the Western media. Let's talk about a few false narratives which have existed for quite a while and which somehow refuse to die even after the full-scale invasion in 2022. So first of all, the war between Russia and Ukraine only started in 2022. True or false?
No, that's absolutely false. The invasion started in 2014. We can talk about various measures Russia took before 2014 that tried to subvert Ukrainian sovereignty. But if we're talking, there can be no doubt that if we're talking about a military invasion, that certainly starts 2014, if not before.
And now another false narrative. It was a civil war.
No, it wasn't. What has to be said, of course, and has to be admitted, is that there was some dissatisfaction with Ukrainian governance throughout the post-Soviet period up until 2014 and indeed after. So there were definitely differing camps and differing political groupings and social groupings within Ukraine. And there's also no doubt that there were, at least to some extent, differing socioeconomic issues, occupying people in different parts of Ukraine. So, for instance, people in eastern Ukraine might at times have different concerns and different sort of interests, socioeconomic, cultural, and so on, from people in certain other parts of Ukraine. But that's not the same as a civil war. It's absolutely true to say that Ukraine has always been a complicated country with a number of different groups in, but you can say that about any country around the world pretty much. You can certainly say that about Russia as well. So it was not a civil war, it was a Russian military invasion.
And also, Russia was making things more complicated, about which we're going to talk in just a few moments. But first, yet another false narrative. Okay, so it was a war between, and still is, between Ukraine and Russia, but Ukraine was to blame because it was doing horrible things to Russian speakers in the Donbas and Crimea. That is yet another false narrative that somehow, again, has survived into the present year, and hopefully it will not survive further beyond that, but it is still around.
It is a false narrative. I mean, again, of course, we have to acknowledge that the Ukrainian state, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian state could have dealt with a number of its minorities and indeed with its population better than it did. So I'm also looking, for instance, at the situation of the Crimean Tatars after the end of the Soviet Union. There's no doubt that the various governments in Kiev, be that under Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, and so on, that they could have handled domestic governance better. That's not the same, however, as saying that there was a systematic persecution taking place, say, of Russian speakers in Ukraine, which is simply not true. It is true that in 2014, in early 2014, you do have violence happening in Kiev. The clear majority of that violence is instigated by the Yanukovych regime, and thereby it's instigated by people who were supported by Russia. Now, it is true that there was also violence in a more limited form from the other side within specific sections of the city of Kyiv. That's not the same as saying that Russian speakers, those who felt affinity with Russian culture, were being persecuted across Ukraine. That is simply not true in 2014 or indeed subsequently.
And this narrative still persists because Russia keeps insisting that, for example, Volodymyr Zelensky is persecuting a specific religious faith in Ukraine, which, by the way, is also not true. Now, is it?
No, it isn't true. I mean, we can talk about the different sort of accusations that have been made by Russia in particular and those associated with Russia, accusations against Volodymyr Zelensky, for instance, that his government was pursuing anti-Semitic policies, which simply is not the case, and you have Jewish communities within Ukraine stating that there is no persecution of Jews. You can also, of course, talking about the disputes within the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, where it should be noted that those disputes were not generally about liturgy. They were generally about who should control the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Should it be controlled from Moscow, or should it be controlled by those who were inside Ukraine? That is not religious persecution. That is a choice made by the religious state and the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian society. Again, nothing to do with religious persecution.
And it is, of course, rather unusual that Russia, which is making all those accusations, is a country that is guilty of the vast majority of things that it accuses Ukraine and many others of actually doing, including persecution of minorities, including on religious grounds. But now, let's go back to Crimea and the Donbas. You've mentioned that things happened before the war even started back in 2014, which made it easier for Russia to create this sort of idea that it does have legitimate interests to protect there. To put it simply, the population there was under the influence of Russia long before the conflict started. Can you tell us more about how Russia went about turning a part of the population around and against the state of Ukraine?
So when we're talking about populations anywhere, and in this case Crimea and Donbas, I think we have to just be careful that we allow for local agency as well. What do I mean by that? I mean that if, for instance, we look at the population in Crimea before 2014, the same could be said about the population in Donbas, but the situation is starker, if you like, in Crimea. In Crimea, you had a population which largely, not exclusively, but largely was Russian-speaking and frequently saw itself as culturally affiliated with Russia. That is, most people in Crimea would look to Russia and think, this is where our cultural, if you like, hearth, our cultural origins come, at least to a large extent. We prefer to speak Russian, so on and so forth. That is not the same as saying that the ordinary person in Crimea would like to be politically or militarily controlled by the Kremlin. That's a separate issue. So I mention all this because we have to consider the situation running up to 2014. Yes, it's true that Russia had some subversive elements, some military forces, for instance, in the Black Sea Fleet, present in and around Crimea and to a lesser extent in Donbas as well. It's also true, of course, that some people working, say, with the Ukrainian government up until 2014, that of Viktor Yanukovych, that some people connected to that wanted to be and were sponsored by Russian actors. However, for locals in the Donbas, for locals in Crimea, when we go up to 2014, locals there wanted what locals in most parts of the world want. They wanted peace, they wanted prosperity, they wanted a solution to some extent, at least in eastern Ukraine in particular, was becoming a little bit of a rust belt. So there were problems with how do we continue, for instance, the heavy industry, how do we continue the mining, so on and so forth, so that local people can continue living reasonably well. And a number of people, not without some reason, a number of people in eastern Ukraine, in Crimea, were looking to Kyiv and thinking, both under Viktor Yushchenko, then under Viktor Yanukovych, Kyiv is not really doing enough for us. Again, this is not the same as saying that ordinary people in the Donbas or in Crimea wanted to be part of the Russian state. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying, though, is that there were some elements, if you like, of local dissatisfaction with the social economic situation, as well as some elements of local people in the Donbas, in Crimea, looking to Russia, noting that we feel Russian in at least part of our culture. There were these elements existing which Russian actors, Russian state-sponsored actors, then went in and exploited. On top of which, of course, the Russian state also sent in, military forces, sent in, sabotage missions, so on and so forth. But that can only be understood, and the relative success of that in 2014, from the Russian point of view, can only be understood if we look at the context in the regions of the Donbas and Crimea.
But before the so-called little green men even arrived in Crimea, the local population there had a little devil on their shoulder in the form of Russian state media.
There was absolutely a problem with Russian state media, and you can see that, in large parts of the former Soviet countries, but also elsewhere in the world, with Russian media. I mean, we were known in the West from RT, for instance, RIA Novosti, Sputnik, so on and so forth. And there's no doubt that as you go up from, let's say, the mid-2000s onwards, Russian media comes, certainly televised media, comes almost completely under the control of the Kremlin, and that control becomes more and more visible. And as we come up, I've mentioned this before in this program, I believe, but as we come up, particularly after Vladimir Putin comes back to the presidency in 2012, you start seeing Russian state media becoming more and more propagandistic, and also, I'm afraid, more and more nationalistic in its broadcasting at home and abroad. So there's no doubt about that. There's also no doubt, of course, and it has to be mentioned, that back in the 1990s, so long before Vladimir Putin becomes anything of national significance in Russia, long before that, in the early 1990s, you do have some Russian actors, once in a while President Boris Yeltsin, but also people like former Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov, for instance, who would play on this idea of a greater Russia, getting back in particular Crimea to Russia as it should really be. So you had Russian actors playing a bit with this narrative that parts of the Ukrainian territory should belong to Russia. But it really sort of gets turbocharged from, let's say, the late 2000s and the early 2010s through Russian media, yeah.
And now we should probably conclude by saying that all those grievances of the local population, none of this was solved. Instead of getting protection from Russia, these people got bombed.
They got bombed, and after that, if you're looking at the areas where the Russian state then got control after 2014, so again Crimea and parts of the Donbas, it has always struck me as quite remarkable that Russia at that point did not go in and do more for local welfare. I mean, here's how I'm thinking about it. Let's say you're Russia, let's say you in 2014 illegally annex, steal parts of Ukrainian territory. If at that point the Russian state had said to the world, a West which in 2014 did not seem particularly concerned about Ukraine, if Russia had then said to the world, look, we know we did something here which is, let's say, challenging international law, but we are now going to make people, for instance, living in Crimea richer than they've ever been, happier than they've ever been. We are going to go in and show that the Russian state can spread welfare and happiness.
The Grozny approach, in other words, right?
I beg your pardon?
The Grozny approach, in other words.
Well, in Grozny and Chechnya, I will say what Russia has done is throw money to the Kadyrov regime and then put up some fancy buildings, but actually done not very much for ordinary people. I think it's the same problem appearing there. The Russian state has generally been very bad at offering, carrots to areas that have been conflict hit. And we saw that again, I'm afraid, in Ukraine, as we've seen in the North Caucasus. Why that hasn't happened, we can have a long discussion about. Honestly, I think the easiest explanation for that is that the Russian state tends to think very short term. It's simply not very good at long-term governance. And we've seen that in Crimea and the Donbas as well.
And arguably also in Russia itself. Rasmus Nilsson was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russia is reportedly relocating its strategic bombers in the wake of Ukraine's spiderweb operation. The Ukrainian operation resulted in the destruction of several Russian bombers located deep within the Russian Federation.
Recent satellite images suggest that Russia has begun relocating its strategic bombers to more remote bases, likely to avoid another spider's web operation from succeeding. Some of the new bases apparently have not been in use by the Russian military for several years, putting into question whether they have the necessary infrastructure to service the aircraft. There is also the possibility that Russian authorities will now relocate the planes more often to prevent another attack. According to Ukrainian officials, Ukraine's massive drone strike on Russian air bases resulted in the destruction or damaging of 41 Russian aircraft. Western officials believe that Russia is preparing a retaliatory strike, but so far, Moscow has only resolved to intensify its regular missile and drone strikes against Ukraine.
The Russians are becoming interested in the moon again. Russia's state space agency Roscosmos says it plans to build a nuclear power plant on the Earth's satellite.
Roscosmos seems to have some very lofty ambitions for Earth's closest friend in the sky. The plan to build a nuclear power plant on the moon is meant to be part of a wider strategy by the agency to improve Russian infrastructure. This involves expanding Russia's satellite network to improve internet bandwidth and coverage across the country, as well as an upgrade to its global navigation system. Roscosmos also wants to move forward with building a new Russian space station that it says will replace the International Space Station. As for plans beyond Earth's orbit, the Russians are interested in exploring Venus and reminded everyone that Russia is the only country to have successfully landed spacecraft on the planet in 1970. Russia's lunar ventures have not been as successful, however, as the last time that Russia put something on the moon was in 1976.
Over 100,000 Russian families are seeking missing soldiers through a special Ukrainian project. This comes as Kiev and Moscow are carrying out the largest prisoner exchanges since the start of the war.
Just in May alone, the Ukrainian I Want to Find initiative received over 12,000 requests from Russian families concerning missing soldiers. The project started in January 2024. The initiative's director believes that there are currently upwards of 100,000 Russian soldiers missing, as many bodies remain unidentified or scattered across battlefields. The Ukrainian initiative also points out that the Russian side seems disinterested in identifying these bodies. What's more, the Russian authorities have acknowledged around 48,000 DNA submissions from families. They avoid declaring soldiers dead so that they won't have to pay out benefits to the relatives. Kiev has also said that the Kremlin conceals the scale of its military losses, which forces families to search independently.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.